Good evening. It is my honor and pleasure, great pleasure, to introduce tonight's speaker, Gwendolyn Dubois Shaw, Associate Professor of Art History at the University of Pennsylvania. Professor Shaw wears many, many hats. She teaches art history, of course, but is also affiliated at Penn with programs in Africana Studies, Cinema Studies, and Gender and Women's Studies. She also serves as the undergraduate chair for the Art History Department and faculty director for the Penn in Havana Summer Abroad program, which I would like to go on. Okay. She received her MA and PhD from Stanford University and her BA from the University of California. Her publications are really too numerous to list, but some related to American art include writings about Matthew William Pryor, Henry Oswasa Tanner, Edward Bannister, and her book Portraits of People, Painting African Americans in the 19th Century, 200 Years of African American Art at the Philadelphia Museum, Norman Lewis, and tonight's topic, Sargent Johnson. Her book on Johnson, entitled Strictly a Negro Art, Sargent Johnson, is forthcoming. Tonight's talk is entitled Sargent Johnson's Dorothy C, Visualizing Race and Romance During the Great Depression. Please welcome Professor Shaw.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here tonight. I know I'm competing with a lot, including hopefully some vigils for Prince. It's very sad that Prince passed today. But we can look at some early 20th century art. Long live Prince, the purple one. It's so sad. In the same year as David Bowie, too. It's very hard. It's very hard. Okay, so here we go. Sargent Johnson was the most highly lauded and successful African-American artist of a generation that came to prominence during the period between the two world wars. During that era, he participated in more exhibitions and received more prizes and awards and commissions than did Aaron Douglas, Chicago's Archibald Motley Jr., or any number of artists who are today better known and more widely celebrated. Johnson belonged to the elite San Francisco Art Association, the SFAA, and served on its council board for many years. He received numerous awards from the SFAA, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the Harmon Foundation, which was the most prominent institutional support for Black artists during the 1920s and early 30s, also gave him a number of awards. And here you can see on the cover of an exhibition of American Negro artists, his piece Sammy on the left, and on the right, piece right here in this building, just if you go upstairs to the American Art Galleries, a bust of a woman from the late 30s that he made. Johnson's works of art were featured in international exhibitions, like the San Francisco Golden Gate International Exposition, and they were reproduced in national magazines, such as this from Life magazine, and foundational art historical texts. They also inspired numerous artists in their own work. And this is The Negro in Art by the great Alain Locke, the philosopher of the Harlem Renaissance, the kind of foremost philosopher. His large-scale public works, made under the auspices of the Federal Art Project during the late 1930s and early 40s, remained focal points for the public buildings in the San Francisco Bay Area where he lived and worked. And here I show you the artist working on the model. You can see him up here at the top, the cast stone model for this frieze at George Washington High School in the city's Richmond district there in San Francisco. Johnson's artistic production is dynamic and complex, and his personal story is uniquely compelling. Both reveal deep contradictions about what it meant to be an artist of African and European descent working within racial subject matter in the United States at mid-century. Here I show you two different photographs taken on the same day in 1935 in Johnson's Oakland, California studio. In each photo, the artist holds a sculptural head of a woman, both with African features, but one made from light-colored cast stone and the other from much darker glazed terracotta. And these are sort of similar, slightly larger pieces than the one that's here at the Art Institute. These staged photos point to Johnson's well-publicized interest in being viewed as an artist who was equally concerned with craft as well as racial representation. He has repeatedly been cited by scholars as expressing a desire to celebrate blackness and African American life. Quote, "I aim at producing strictly a Negro art," he told a newspaper in 1935. He said, "studying not the culturally mixed Negro of the cities, but the more primitive, slave type, as existed in this country during the period of slave importation," close quote. A straightforward enough statement, but a provocative one given his own background as the son of Eliza Jackson, an African-descended woman who had been born into slavery, and Anderson Johnson, a man who physically read as white, even though he was probably actually of Swedish descent. So rather than reading as white, he was probably white. Sargent Johnson may have said that he wanted to produce strictly a Negro art, but, and my forthcoming book argues this, what he actually made throughout his career was art that evoked the experience of the more culturally mixed Negro that he supposedly eschewed. Johnson, who self-identified as African American, was often mistaken by others as white. He had at least one sibling who broke from the family altogether and passed into whiteness while in his teens. Johnson frequently made art that, like his own body, was racially ambiguous. This practice may have allowed him to both hide and reveal the challenges of transcending the limiting racial designations of white and black, Negro, and American. To better understand the racially ambivalent artistic practice of Johnson, today I'll discuss his efforts at creating African-inspired copper masks in his personal artistic practice, and a number of lithographs that he made at the Federal Art Project's print workshop in San Francisco. And these are some of the pieces that I'll be looking at. Dorothy C, a lithograph made by the artist around 1938 is a cubist rendering of a woman's body marching through space, a highly abstracted figure set amidst intersecting planes and undulating lines. The tip of her small black shoes barely touched the frame line of the print, the right toe pointing at the H of the artist's signature, and a ellipse of a hat perches on her head, colored black with an undulating plume of white crossing its apex, vaguely reminiscent in its kidney shape of an artist's palette, but perhaps also a thought bubble, the plume of cigarette smoke, or a passing bit of San Francisco's famous fog. Her head comprised of several sharply arcing lines and covered by a cross-hatching that reveals little more than the dot of an eye and the crisp point of a long, straight nose. Her hair is tucked within a snood that repeats the cross-hatched pattern of the veil, the two mixing together in a mass of overlapping lines. The mask-like visage tilts downward toward a large, open, bifold newspaper made recognizable as such by the subtle indications of article columns scribbled across its surface, and you can just kind of make those out here. Dorothy C is given only a first name and a last initial. Like the cross-hatched veil that both creates and obscures her face, she is only partly knowable. Throughout the composition, Johnson has shaded the various areas to create depth and overlap in forms, while leaving untouched the space between the form lines that make up Dorothy C's hands and her voluptuously rounded legs in order to retain the white color of the paper on which it is printed. These shapely gams emerge from the bifurcating lines of the parallel planes that make up a skirt to end in those small black shoes. Dorothy C exists just outside of our reach, feet not quite touching the ground, head in the clouds, a phantom dancing through the space of the modern city as the fragmented lines of the city streets rise and fall behind her. She is a spectral figure, a body through which we can see, held together by a linear border, a transparent space, a crystalline vessel. The whiteness of the page that remains visible after having felt the hard press of the cleanly wiped stone. The enigmatic and almost invisible Dorothy C is a product both of Johnson's imagination and of the print studio of the New Deal Federal Art Project, which began funding artists to create public works, easel paintings, and prints in 1935. Between that time and 1943, when the program ended, Johnson was lucky to find work in their sponsored studios. In the 1910s, he had worked as a Pullman porter or a dining car waiter, and by the 20s, he was also making frames for Schussler Brothers' San Francisco gallery. But by the depth of the Depression in the 1930s, he sought out work from the government. And I show you these pictures of Pullman porters. Johnson lived here for a while in Chicago. He had brothers and some of his sisters and their husbands, and they all worked on the railroad. The men did as Pullman porters, and that was what brought him out to the San Francisco Bay Area, out to Oakland. The FAP paid modestly, and it gave artists a chance to participate in large-scale public decoration. This extensive state-sponsored commissioning was something that had no previous parallel in the history of American art. Johnson participated in a variety of FAP projects, including that at the Aquatic Park Bathhouse in San Francisco. He eventually became one of only 2 African Americans in the entire country to rise to the level of FAP supervisor. The FAP was charged with beautifying the country's public buildings and municipal spaces by employing out-of-work artists like Johnson to create murals, monumental and decorative sculpture, and other material embellishments, including easel paintings and prints. And the work that he did at the Aquatic Park are these tile murals, which are really quite lovely and are in great shape today. If you go out to the Bay Area, I encourage you to go and see them. It was in the San Francisco FAP print workshop that the majority of Johnson's lithographs, including Dorothy C, were made between 1936 and 41, when the program was active. For the most part, the WPA in the Bay Area did not discriminate on racial grounds in their hiring. But that did not mean that it was easy to secure employment with the agency. Johnson's friend, the African-American journalist Thomas C. Fleming, was also able to get on with the WPA, and thankfully we have Fleming's reminiscences on this. And he says, quote, "I got a WPA job right away and dug ditches for 1 or 2 days," he recalled. "Then they found out that I had more than 2 years of college and that I had done some writing for the Oakland Tribune. So they sent me out to the Federal Writers Project at Bancroft Library on the campus of the University of California, Berkeley. It paid $94 a month. That was the top pay they gave you at WPA. The unskilled workers got about $60 a month," close quote. Fleming realized his good fortune at being employed by the government, it being less racist an environment than the private sector, and I quote, "The job only lasted about 6 months because the funds ran out for that particular project. I was the only black person in the group, and they accepted me as a colleague. But even though I did the same work as they did for the WPA, I knew I could not get a job on a daily newspaper because there were only 2 in the country that had hired a black reporter up until that point, the Boston Globe and the New York Post," close quote. Toward the end of his life, when Johnson was asked about his own experiences in the WPA, he echoed Fleming's sentiments regarding the unique opportunity that these programs had offered African Americans. But he also hinted at the difficulty in simply getting hired on. Quote, "I came over to San Francisco and, well, I met Hilaire, who's a painter," he remembered. "He wanted to know why I wasn't on the WPA, and I said, well, I went down and they wouldn't take me. But he said, all right, you go with me tomorrow, and I'll see that you get on. So I went with Hilaire, and I was allowed on. I was given a job," close quote. Hilaire and Johnson would go on to work together at the Aquatic Park Bathhouse, Johnson creating the exterior tile murals and Hilaire painting the interior walls. During the late 1930s, while working for the FAP, Johnson began to create lithographs in the program's studio in San Francisco. And these lithographs reveal his interest in both the formal techniques of synthetic cubism and his desire to incorporate motifs and modes derived from African art, such as masking. In conjunction with contemporary African-American the contemporary African-American New Negro movement, cultural themes of racial two-ness and social masking began to appear in his work. One of these prints, titled White and Black, that I show you here, won the $25 Artist Prize at the annual exhibition of drawings and prints held by the San Francisco Art Association in 1938. It is an image that defies easy characterization. It is both male and female, black and white, as though two bodies had become fused together into a matrix of intersecting lines, some straight, others curved, creating overlapping planes. The shapes made by these planar slices of form hint at the socialized body. Some of them contain fragmentary patterns or various levels of shading, white to gray or black, that mimic an item of clothing, a figure's hair, or some other marker of culturally inscribed identity. Alternating stripes of black and white recall the ribbon trim of a floor-length skirt. Consecutive circles on a conical slice recall the studs of a man's vest. A warmly shaded S-curve, its tail ending in three sharp cutbacks, evokes the profile of a face. Along the left side of the profile, marking its border, is half of an arcing line that completes a white and black ovid form, a small slit on its right side, perhaps a hole through which an eye might peek, breaking its surface. And here I'm describing all of this up at the top. The juxtaposition of this mask-like form in the profile suggests double lives and the metaphorical masks behind which many African Americans have lived in order to protect their true selves from the gaze of those who might attempt to oppress or define them as less than human. It was, quote, a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, and here I'm quoting W.E.B. Du Bois, this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. And this is Du Bois from The Souls of Black Folks. And this is something that's often quoted when we think about African American art during this period. He says, quote, one ever feels his two-ness, an American, a Negro, two warring souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body, whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder, close quote. Du Bois's idea of two-ness or double consciousness echoes the contemporary poetry of Paul Laurence Dunbar, who in his 1896 poem, We Wear the Mask, laments, we wear the mask that grins and lies, it hides our cheeks and shades our eyes. This debt we pay to human guile, with torn and bleeding hearts we smile and mouth with myriad subtleties. Why should the world be overwise in counting all our tears and sighs? Nay, let them only see us while we wear the mask. We smile, but, oh, great Christ, our cries to thee from tortured souls arise. We sing, but, oh, the clay is vile beneath our feet, and long the mile, but let the world dream otherwise. We wear the mask. Johnson's two-ness came not just from being black and American, but also from having black and white parents, I would argue. His mother, primarily of African descent, his understanding was, as I mentioned, that his father was primarily Swedish. The title of the lithograph itself, Black and White, inverts the more common phrase, White and Black, inverts the more common phrase, black and white, that is so often used to describe the grayscale productions in photographic and graphic arts. But it also hints at the presence of something hidden, e.g. not just white, but also black, as though they were part of the same subject that was obscured or hidden, one behind the other. During the 1930s, Johnson made numerous masks, many using beaten copper sheets and abstracted forms that echoed African masks. In the 1920s, the display of African art and masks in particular was still very rare in the United States, and these are two of his masks next to some reproductions here. In 1910, the African Hall opened at New York City's American Museum of Natural History. In 1914, the photographer and gallery owner Alfred Stieglitz mounted an exhibition of African Negro art at his Manhattan Gallery 291. And between 1916 and 1917, the Mexican-born artist Marius de Zayas organized a series of exhibitions that included works of African sculpture at the Modern Gallery before opening his own gallery where he exhibited such work for the next 5 years. In 1923, the Brooklyn Museum published a catalog of primitive Negro art in their collection, which consisted primarily of objects from what was then the Belgian Congo. And there were also a small number of books in circulation on African art, including Carl Einstein's very famous 1910 volume, Negro Plastique. However, prior to 1926, there was no significant scholarly acknowledgement or display of African art that was accessible on the West Coast. And Johnson's interaction with it would have come only through travel to New York or through reproductions. But since he was a Pullman porter, he may have gone to New York, he may have seen things there. While Johnson was loath to acknowledge this job as a Pullman porter in his biography publicly, it was an occupation that allowed him this kind of geographic mobility, so it is plausible that, like these men, he would have moved back and forth across the country. In spite of the paucity of African source material to be seen firsthand in the United States between the World Wars, Johnson probably found a way to incorporate African design into his art by using the important volume, The New Negro. This influential 1924 anthology, which was conceived and edited by the Harvard-trained philosopher and Rhodes Scholar and Howard University professor Alain Locke, he may have received this as a gift from a family member, or he may have purchased it himself. But it's important for what it contained inside because there were reproductions of 6 pieces of African art from the collection of Albert C. Barnes, 2 of which I show you here at the top, which are on view presently at the Barnes Foundation. If you make it to Philadelphia, you can see them there. Dr. Barnes was notoriously reluctant to allow reproductions of works that he owned to circulate, so it's highly significant that he made these images available for publication in The New Negro. And this is a modern printing of The New Negro. In the layout of the book, most of the images were placed alongside Alain Locke's germinal essay, The Legacy of the Ancestral Arts. This essay served as the philosopher's manifesto on the importance of African art to the creation of a distinctly modern and uniquely Negro visual art aesthetic for the contemporary moment. Locke, who had spent time in England and Europe prior to the First World War and had had the opportunity to visit many of the great ethnographic collections of African material culture while abroad, began his essay by arguing for the primacy of the oral with an A and the oral with an O, tradition in African American culture. But he then quickly moved to a discussion of the visual arts. And I quote, "Music and poetry, and to an extent the dance, have been the predominant arts of the American Negro," he wrote. This is an emphasis quite different from that of African cultures, where the plastic and crafts arts predominate. Africa being one of the great fountain sources for the arts of decoration and design. In idiom, technical treatment, and objective social angle, African-American artists, New Negro artists, and I'm kind of paraphrasing here, must make a bold iconoclastic break with the current traditions that have grown up around the Negro subject in American art. It is not meant to dictate a style to the young Negro artist, but to point the lesson that contemporary European art has already learned. That any vital artistic expression of the Negro theme and subject in art must break through the stereotypes to a new style, a distinctive fresh technique, and some sort of characteristic idiom, close quote. After expanding on the importance of African art to European modern avant-gardes, he expressed his hope that, quote, "The sensitive artistic mind of the American Negro, stimulated by a cultural pride and interest, will receive from African art a profound and galvanizing influence. The legacy is there, at least, with prospects for a rich yield," close quote. Visual resonances can be seen easily between Johnson's masks and the works of African art that were reproduced in The New Negro. The sculptor has translated the shininess of the wood accrued through years of natural handling by users into the warm glow of the copper from which he pounded out his works. This change in material may be attributed to his misreading of the reproductions, which bore no descriptive labels beyond some apocryphal attributions to various African groups. In his study of the designs produced by these African carvers, Johnson was evidently drawn to the oval shapes, linear patterning, and smooth planar abstraction that they favored, creating sort of Art Deco versions of African art. Because there were no public or private collections of African art in California in the 20s and 30s that would have been available to him, it seems highly likely that the objects from the Barnes collection that were published in the New Negro served to inform his practice. The African-inspired masks made by Johnson in the 20s and 30s, like the abstracted human forms that are found in white and black, are indebted to the synthetic cubism of Picasso, with that mode's tendency to not only break an image apart into different planes, but also to push it together into a flattened, shared space. In white and black, rather than taking apart a single figure, Johnson merges two seeming opposites into one body, the man's suit and the woman's dress, the black face and the white mask. But it is an African-style mask, one that hints at the artistic journey that the artist had taken during the preceding decades as his artistic identity and interests grew. In this work, Johnson found a way to combine both the personal and the political beliefs that were shaping his life at that moment. He sutures these disparate elements together, making it difficult for the viewer to identify whether the shaded profile belongs to the body of the woman or the man, the self or the other, that which is known and that which is hidden. The ambiguity witnessed in white and black is also found in the equally inexplicable Dorothy C, which has been described by my colleague, the art historian Leslie King Hammond, as a, quote, abstract and stylized composition that clearly reflects Johnson's deep love for his people, close quote. In this quote, taken from the main essay of the 1989 exhibition catalog, Black Printmakers in the WPA, King Hammond implies that as one of these black printmakers of the show's title, Johnson's people are black, and therefore the subject of Dorothy C is black as well. King Hammond provides us with a reflexive reading of the figure as that of an African American, but what are we to make of the print if the specific Dorothy C to whom it refers, and such that title implies, I would argue, a specific referent, what if Dorothy C herself was not in fact a woman of African descent at all? Which of Johnson's people would she then represent? The black people of his mother's family, the white ancestors of his fathers, or the variety of people with whom he associated in the multiracial San Francisco art world of the 20s and 30s and 40s, such as Thomas C. Fleming and Hilaire Hilaire. I would argue that given the visual evidence, the lack of any shading on the legs, hands, or face of Dorothy C, that might indicate the presence of African blood, his subject was most probably a white woman. And given the artist's use of a first name and a last initial, it was probably the portrait of a specific white woman. And I think it's one of these two women here. Either the painter Dorothy Cravath, a San Francisco artist of German descent with whom Johnson was good friends and colleagues for nearly 50 years, or possibly Dorothy Collins, a publicist who managed the Federal Art Project offices in Northern California between 1933 and 45, and supervised at least one of the program's murals for the Enlisted Men's Club at Fort Ord. The mural over there by Lucien Lebeau that's at the beach chalet shows Collins, and there you can see Dorothy Cravath painting the Mother House mural at Fleischacker Zoo, which is no longer extant. Born in Texas in 1901, before relocating with her family to Half Moon Bay, California as a child, for most of her career, the first Dorothy was professionally known by her married name, Puccinelli. She was a gifted artist who studied alongside Johnson at the California School of Fine Arts, which is now the San Francisco Art Institute, in the early 1920s. She was also a writer and an art critic, which may account for that newspaper that the female figure in Dorothy C clutches in her gloved hands. During the late 30s, she participated in several federal art projects, including a cycle of murals that I show you here, which depicted Noah's Ark. She also completed a mural on California history at the Maine Post Office in Merced, California. The Mother's House murals were mentioned in a Los Angeles Times article from 1936, just a few sentences away from a reference to a different FAP project that Sargent Johnson was being considered for, a set of mosaic murals at the administration building for the Golden Gate Bridge. In fact, Johnson had been assigned to a job at the zoo during the same time that Dorothy Puccinelli and Edith Hamlin were painting there, but Johnson's project was never completed. He later recalled that it was a whole series, and I quote, of animals, these are sculptural animals, that were to be placed on one of the squares on each side so that when you went through, you could see all of these carved animals like we had in the zoo, but we couldn't get the money, close quote. However, this didn't stop him from going to see his friends at work, and he said that I used to go and watch the ladies paint often, close quote. He later recalled this when he was asked about the project at the zoo. Between 1935 and 41, when the FAP San Francisco Print Workshop was open, and he was making that print, oh, here's some more Dorothy Cravath work. When he made the print for Dorothy C, Dorothy Puccinelli and her first husband, Raymond, a sometime actor and sculptor, separated. Raymond went to New York to study art, and Dorothy lived as a single woman in an apartment at 444A Greenwich Street on Telegraph Hill. She remained single for several years before eventually marrying Wallace Chick Cravath, the brother of the sculptor Ruth Cravath, and I show you Ruth Cravath here. When interviewed later about her sister, Ruth Cravath said the following, and she kind of recalled her in highly romantic terms, and I quote at length because it's such a funny quote. She says, "But speaking of Dorothy and her ability to do fine things and so forth, she was such an absolutely superb craftswoman, as you know, and an absolute manual control she had of everything, just absolutely. For 50 years I have watched that woman, I am sure you have too, with a drink in her hand, twirling the glass like this, and the liquid would go up and down, and for 50 years I held my breath and never once did a drop spill over the glass. You remember how she always did that, don't you, with a drink? Always, I mean, a glass of sherry or a glass of wine or any glass, and she would twirl the glass like this. And of course the liquid would move around and around and around, and oh, and sometimes I used to get a little nervous, and for 50 years I have known her never to drop a glass of wine. And this is a great example of her manual dexterity, her manual control. I wouldn't dare do that. I would spill it right away." Close quote. The magnetism of the young divorcee who gaily swirled her wine glass at parties may have been irresistible for Johnson, who had by that point separated from his wife. While it is possible that the painter Dorothy Cravath was the subject of the print Dorothy C, it is even more likely that Dorothy Collins, the manager of the FAP offices, was the inspiration. Collins, who was also a divorcee, was responsible for distributing the prints and easel paintings that the artist created under the project's auspices for display in regional libraries, schools, and municipal buildings. Collins was a favorite of the WPA artists who she worked with, and she appears here as a fashionably dressed woman lounging on a park bench next to the project director, William Gaskins, in Lucien Lebeau's 1936 mural at the chalet. So this is Gaskins here, included in the mural. Although Collins sits alongside him, the two do not appear to be a couple. Her long arm drapes over the back of the bench, extending an offering of a nut to a squirrel while he rests his forearms on its upper rail. Elegantly gray in her middle 40s, Lebeau depicted Collins as a silver-haired woman in a royal purple coat topped by a faux fur collar that matches her hair. The arc of the collar extends down her arm to the squirrel below, creating a sympathetic relationship between the two. That Johnson and Collins were close is demonstrated by her acquisition sometime in the 1940s of at least one group of Johnson's ceramics, including a teapot of a hybrid pre-Columbian design that you see here with a jaguar handle and a vaguely anthropomorphic head. This is now in the collection of the Oakland Museum of California. The teapot was one of a series of vessels that the artist created in his own kind of Mesoamerican style shortly after working on the court of Pacifica at the Golden Gate International Exposition on Treasure Island in 1939. A photograph of this exposition that I show you here shows the large-scale Incan figures that Johnson had designed and executed for the exposition. These Incan figures riding on the backs of llamas are variations on a theme. One plays the characteristic reed pipes while the other holds the reins of his mount. The second llama on the right in the photograph has its mouth open as though braying, much in the same way that the jaws of the abstracted jaguar handle fall open on the pot that Dorothy Collins once owned. Dorothy Collins's teapot may have been originally paired with a set of cups, similar to the one that survived in this nearly identical set that is today in a private collection. The cups are cylindrical in design with flat-sided handles and rectangular flanges that jut out on the opposite sides. Their exterior ochre glaze, which matches that of the pot they accompany, is set off by a cream-colored interior. One of the cups is decorated with abstract patterns of lines, dots, and chevrons, while the other hosts a scene of two silhouetted lovers on a park bench. The dark bodies appear to merge into each other. The male figure strums a guitar made visible as an outline against the ochre glaze. Although formally different, the motif of the guitar that appears on the teacup is similar to the guitar strumming figures of another of Johnson's lithographs made in the FAP print workshop, that of Singing Saints from 1940. But here it's much more romantically suggestive rather than spiritually so, with the head of the musician leaning in towards his companion as he serenades her. As we have seen in the 1930s and 40s, this was a busy time for Johnson. Not only was he working on large-scale public projects, making lithographs in the FAP workshop, he was also making those copper masks inspired by reproductions of African models and Mesoamerican-derived tea sets, all in his Oakland studio. At the same time, he was learning to play the guitar, which might account for his interest in repeatedly depicting the instrument in Singing Saints and on these little teacups. By casting these serenading figures in black silhouette, Johnson has obscured their identities even more completely than he did when he absented the details of Dorothy C's facial features behind the cross-hatched lines of her veil, making her into a nearly invisible woman. Like Dorothy C, the identity of Johnson's two lovers remains unrecoverable, lost to time. But what is clear, however, is Johnson's artistic interest in developing both an African-inspired new Negro art that adhered to Alain Locke's prescriptions and to depicting aspects of his own modern life in a way that often obscured its overt realities, cloaking his more personal work in a code of initials and purposely oblique titles. I would argue that Dorothy C and White and Black both hint at the artist's interest in interracial relationships, such as the one between his mother, Eliza Jackson, and his father, Anderson Johnson, and perhaps also at his own desire for a relationship with a woman named Dorothy, a relationship about which he could not be completely transparent in the America of the 1930s. Thank you. I'm happy to take questions if anybody has, and you can shout them out and I'll repeat them so other people can hear them. But if you don't, it's like okay too. Nanette.
I was struck when you showed the photographs of the Pullman porters and their uniforms, and there's the set in all white and all black, and it made me think about class in relation to these images and whether you think Johnson is commenting on that, if there's class lines that work.
Yeah, so these Pullman porters are so fascinating. And I have to tell you that this one down here, this is one of these men, I think it's this fellow here. This is the father of the art historian Judith Wilson. And she posted this on Facebook to kind of like talk about what it was like to grow up in Oakland in the middle of the century, and how there were so many middle-class African Americans who were able to make lives and raise children and send them to college and go on to do great things because of this sort of work. I mean, this was like as good as it got, right? You made a lot of money, you got to travel, you had mobility, you had a kind of middle class grounding. If you worked well, you got tips. And the way that I found out that Johnson was a Pullman porter, because he doesn't ever talk about this in any of the interviews, was that he was good friends with Robert Colescott's father, who was also a Pullman porter, the painter Robert Colescott. So you can see how this kind of world was, it was one that was dependent on the service industry to survive, but it was like the best kind of service industry that one could be in. And then, of course, there were all these different, kind of hierarchies of color, within that, and depending on how light or dark you were, you could occupy different jobs or not. So, does that answer your question a little bit? Yeah. Okay. Good. Uh-huh.
Actually, my question follows up on the question of the Pullman porter, which I didn't know. What years was he a porter?
Well, I think so. When was he a porter? I think he started at about 1910. He was a young man then, in his 20s. He came here first to Chicago, and he really wanted to be an artist. He had studied in Boston, and none of his family, who were living this kind of, bougie Pullman porter lifestyle, thought that was something that you should do, and so they pretty quickly got him on the rails. But it's hard to know. He shows up in his brother shows up in the census here in 1910 and 1900, and then Johnson after 1915 he shows up in San Francisco first, and then later he moves to Oakland, and Oakland was the terminus for the railroad. So like today, if you take the Amtrak to San Francisco, you end up in Oakland, then you get on a bus to San Francisco, which sucks, right? It's a drag. But so there was a big community in Oakland of these porters who were there. And I think that he does it through the 30s. He's able, after that, his art, he's able to make enough money doing that, and he travels a lot. He wins different awards. He travels to Mexico, to Japan. I found, this is the great blessing that is Ancestry.com, right? For researchers, the manifest for these ships going across the ocean, and Pan Am manifest for people flying across. So he did a lot of international travel after that in the 40s and 50s, and so I think he, by that point, he's doing pretty well.
Yeah, I was curious, just because of the 1927 Negro and Art Week that was here. Mm-hmm. He's still a Pullman porter at that point.
Yeah.
The Zephyr or whatever it was.
Yeah. I'd like to think of him doing that, saying, hey, buddy, I need to go out and see this show in Chicago, or I want to go to New York, and my stuff's going to be up. Some of the exhibitions that the Harmon Foundation organized, they traveled across the country, so they did come out to California. His maternal aunt, May Howard Jackson, who was a sculptor, also served on the juries for some of the early exhibitions. She dies in 1931. But they never, during either of their lifetimes, acknowledged that familial relationship, because she's totally nepotistic for her nephew, which is like where the word comes from, so it's totally appropriate, right? But so she never acknowledges him during her lifetime, and vice versa. But then later, people begin to talk about it. There are all these kind of these aspects of his life that didn't, I would argue, conform to what he thought an artist was supposed to be. He was born Sargent Harrison Johnson, and he drops Harrison, and he takes Claude. Like, we know him, Sergeant Claude Johnson, but that's made up. It's a name that he takes on because that's the name for artist, right? Claude Lorrain, Claude Monet, right? It's an artist name. It's kind of French. So he takes it on in order to create this identity for himself. This is not the identity of an artist, right? And so he has to kind of to build that. And in the 50s, when he's living in North Beach in California, in this very bohemian, artsy neighborhood, he just wants to be called Claude. He doesn't want to be called Sargent anymore. Just call me Claude. I think it's kind of funny. He's cute. Get very affectionate. Yes?
Okay, so I'm trying to understand where he was trained.
Uh-huh.
And when you said Pullman Porter, I'm like, oh, okay. But then the
Yeah.
time frame, I'm going, he was a little bit even more ahead of the artists that were working here in Chicago. Elizabeth Catlett, although the Howard University, Allen Locke connection is there, but he didn't know Allen Locke, he just was reading a book.
Well, I think I don't know that he ever met Alain Locke. I think he probably did. May Howard Jackson, his maternal aunt, her husband was this man, William Tecumseh Sherman Jackson. Great name, right? You know, how do you name your kid that in 1865 is what I like. That's really bold to do that in Virginia in 1865. But she taught art at Howard for a number of years, and her husband ran the M Street School, which is now Dunbar High School, which was the first black prep school in the country, and so they knew Locke very well. And I believe that Johnson probably met Locke through them. He probably got a copy of the New Negro through them. He trained a little bit at the School of the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, just like for a very short period of time there. And then when he comes out to California, he studies at a couple of places. One was called the A.W. Best School of Art, which I think was just run by a guy named A.W. Best, and he taught painting in his living room. And then he goes to the California School of Fine Arts, which is now the San Francisco Art Institute, and he attends there for at least 3 years. He doesn't take a degree, but that's pretty common then. You know, it's not like an MFA today or a BFA that actually matters. He studied there, and he continued, you know, working in a community of artists. He was always surrounded by other artists of all different, I want to say of all different colors, but frankly, there were not that many black folks in San Francisco who were working as artists in the 30s and 40s. So I think he was pretty much on his own, kind of doing that. His politics were almost non-existent in terms of, you know, he was not a socialist or a communist. He wasn't like, you know, Catlett and Charles White, who were really radical and doing lots of active anti-racist activities during the 30s that made them really suspect. And as a result, he was able to get these FAP, these WPA assignments without freaking anybody out that he was a communist artist. And since he was light-skinned, I think that also really helped to make him less of, you know, make him stand out a lot less. But he, I don't think that he ever taught, but he continued to study and he continued to be interested in what other artists were doing. He wrote, pardon me? He married a woman named Pearl in 1915 in San Francisco. They had a daughter also named Pearl Adele, who ended up moving here to Chicago. And I wanted to like shoot myself when I found out that she died in 2007. And it, you know, it's like so frustrating. But she never had any children. He has some relatives who, you know, like great nieces and nephews, who some of them are here in the Chicago area. But he was pretty much estranged from his wife. She went crazy in the 1930s and ended her life in a state mental institution after about 20 years of being there, which is very sad. But he was quite a ladies man. He had lots of girlfriends in North Beach, but he never remarried. So. Well, thank you for coming.